if it's possible financially, I really think the best thing to do is to just edit, because even no matter how much you learn, whatever you do in school, whatever, it doesn't compare to just being able to do the job.
Hi, and welcome back to StudioBinder Academy. I'm Brandon. Today we're speaking with editor Jay Prychidny. Jay, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So we always like to start with everyone's background. Could you tell us what inspired you to be a filmmaker?
I was just always in love with movies, from just a really young age. It was really just a special thing to kind of watch movies and escape into that world. And, I think that's why movies are important to so many people, especially when they're young and growing up. I mean, it kind of is just a way to escape from their lives and explore kind of different realities in a way. And, I mean, that was a real comfort to me, when I was a kid. So I just always had this real passion to just get into it from a really young age. And I just pursued it, and then it was kind of the only thing I pursued. I was very kind of single-minded on that. Lots of people say I'm like one of the most single-minded kids they'd ever seen. So, that's kind of how it happened.
Okay. And were there any particular filmmakers or films that were inspiring to you?
Well, I mean, Tim Burton and Beetlejuice are definitely a huge movie for me when it came out. I was 7 years old when I saw it, and it was just such an imaginative movie. I just remember feeling like just like I'd never seen anything like that. It just seemed on a different level to me as a kid from other movies, and just exploring something that I'd never seen in a way I'd never seen. The imagination, the kind of comedy mixed with the grotesquerie, it really just fired my imagination as a kid. So definitely Tim Burton was a huge influence for sure. And growing up in Canada as a film nerd, you can't kind of help but be like influenced by David Cronenberg and Adam McGoyan, who were in the 80s and 90s really at the forefront of Canadian movies. So I was definitely very influenced and obsessed by them as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I loved the original Beetlejuice movie. Yeah,
Yeah.
like you, I was growing up and I saw that, and like you said, it was so different, and I think that's kind of what got me into the horror genre. It was
Mm.
my introduction, and then I just fell in love with that genre. So Tim Burton, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's definitely an entry point for like screwing up kids, but in a great way. When we did the Beetlejuice previews, I did, invite friends, and, I invited the director of Scream 6 to come see one of the early cuts
Mhm.
of Beetlejuice. And he brought his child. I think he was about seven or eight. And he
Mhm.
was like very anxious about it, because he'd never seen a horror. He was calling it a horror movie. This is my first horror. And he was like, scared through the movie, but by the end of it he was just kind of exhilarated, like he'd accomplished something. It's like, I watched my first horror movie, I did it. So I mean, that's really cool, actually.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. And was there anything that drew you specifically to editing?
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't kind of really focus in on editing until I went to university in Toronto for film. And it was kind of midway through my university program that I kind of started to focus in on editing,
Mm.
where I kind of realized that that's what I was really kind of most interested in and enjoyed doing the most. But I mean, kind of looking back, when I was a kid and making my own movies and stuff, I mean, so much of what was driving me to do that was just trying to understand literally the construction of film, which is, of course, editing, But, when I'm a kid, I'm not thinking about it that way, but I'm like really kind of looking at these films and analyzing, like, how did they make these and how did they put this together, which is, of course, what editing is. But I guess it took me a little longer to realize that I was interested in editing. Lots of other people from my life say, "Oh, we knew you wanted to be an editor since you were 8 years old." I'm like, well, I didn't know that until much later, but cool.
Excellent. Excellent. Now, if you wouldn't mind, could you kind of walk us through your career path, kind of where you started, film school through how you got to where you are now?
after school, I just, it took me a while, but I just started editing kind of right out of school, and just, very low budget, very low paid. I think the first couple years out of school, I made like $8,000 a year or something like that. I was living at home, so I didn't have any bills, thankfully. I just kind of started editing. And then my first job after that was working at a television network in Toronto. And then that led to editing kind of lifestyle, documentary, reality type programming. And then I made this switch into doing scripted children's television, and then scripted
Wow.
adult television, and then into movies. So kind of just this, I kind of edited all the way along, and then just kind of slowly kind of upgrading the level of projects I was working on.
Now, speaking of the work, I'd like to talk a little bit about the actual work of editing. As an editor, what's your ideal process when you begin a project? Like when do you typically get brought on?
It's usually around the first day of filming, or a
Okay.
couple days before if you're lucky.
Okay, and do you read through the script? Are you making notes or anything like that?
Yeah, so you get the script. I mean, I'm so bad at reading scripts. I really, I find them just really hard to pay attention to. So I kind of read them in kind of a funny way. I read them, but I'm really kind of I don't make notes or anything. I just kind of read it and just I mean, in all parts of my job, I'm really always kind of letting my emotional reactions to things be the primary thing that I'm paying attention
Okay.
to. So when I'm reading a script, really the thing I'm looking for most is, where am I hooked in emotionally? Where am I interested? Um, and that helps guide me what I think about the script. Because if it's like 40 pages of setup,
Mhm.
and I'm in this feeling of things being set up, and I'm not really engaged yet, or I'm not really hooked in emotionally to the characters, then I realize, okay, well, there's some kind of issue here in the beginning. It's like taking way too long for me actually to get into what's going on. So that's how I kind of analyze my first reactions to the script, is just kind of how I'm emotionally feeling. Like, am I, in the present moment of the characters and what they're going through, or am I just feeling like I'm waiting for something to happen? And I guess those feelings, I do, those kind of instant emotional reaction feelings in terms of what I think isn't working, or what I think is working, or the characters or the
Mhm.
moments that I'm really interested in. I do often really take that through all the way, because those are kind of my touchstones in a way, of the things I want to either fix in the edit, or the things that I want to really highlight and bring out and let the audience feel what I felt when I was reading it.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Now, in terms of like, they always say just fix it in post. Um, you say you're typically brought on the first day of filming. As filming continues, do are you in, are there conversations with the director or director of photography of like, hey, this type of shot would really cut well together in terms of the edit? Are there any of those discussions being had during production?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the project. I mean, with Beetlejuice, Tim Burton, I mean, his process is always to be very connected in with editorial and what's happening in the edit, to see if he's getting it, if he's getting all the
Mhm.
stuff he needs. But also to kind of inform him about what he's shooting, I mean, let it get in more in his brain about what is this film. And so it can actually inform how he shoots future stuff. When he sees something cut together, he can see it. And if he wants to make tweaks or changes or adjust how a character is coming off or whatever, he can do that in the, shooting days that are coming up. But, while he's shooting, I'll be at the studio, right by the set where they're filming. And
Mhm.
whenever he has a break, he can just pop over for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. We can show him a scene. And yeah, we'll talk about it. If there is stuff that I think is missing, yeah, we'll talk about it. Um,
Okay.
it has to usually be stuff that is really important to get, because you don't want to just
Mm.
always be saying, well, let's fix this or let's fix
Right.
this. They're like constantly. But I mean, we show him the scene, we talk about it, and we come to an agreement on if it's working or if there's additional stuff we need to get. So that happens all the time. And so that avoids some, getting pickups or additional photography
Mhm.
later on down the road, because in the middle of shooting, he can just see, there was one example where he, in the Soul Train sequence where he didn't get a close up of Astrid in a, key scene. And so it's like we looked at it, we talked about it, and it's just like, yeah, it's like we really need to get that. So then in the next day or two, he just went back to that set and picked up that close up, So stuff like that kind of happens all the time.
In terms of coverage, some directors get a lot of coverage and others don't. In your experience, do you prefer, the exploration process of having a lot of footage and finding the right bits that go with the right other bits? Or do you like the challenge of, ha- trying to put something together with what you have?
Yeah, I mean it's all kind of the same process in a way. I mean, you need to get to the same end product, you know. So, but it is different. I mean, Tim is kind of the perfect example of a director who does not shoot too much. I mean, because it's such a process for him to figure out how he wants to shoot something. It's just not in his nature to kind of overshoot and let's get it from this
Mhm.
angle, let's get it from this angle, that and that and that, and just like we'll figure it out later. I mean, for him, the process is figuring out what he's going to shoot, and just getting to a shot that he thinks is good is like an entire process for him. So then he doesn't want to
Mhm.
then also get something else that he thinks is good. If he's got it, he's got it. And that is a challenge sometimes, for sure. You have a lot of creative freedom in editing all the time, but it's definitely a different thing when you have less footage as opposed to when you have
Mhm.
tons. I mean, the primary difference is you really can't turn a scene into anything,
Right.
when you have just a little amount of footage to work with. I mean, basically, the nature of the scene is what it is. You don't have the latitude to
Mhm.
really make it like the opposite, or which you do a lot of the time when something has tons and tons of coverage. You can really just almost make the scene anything you want to be. So there's
Yeah.
there is more freedom in that way, definitely, when you have more coverage.
Now, in terms of, you've been talking about Tim Burton a lot. What's your ideal working relationship with the director?
I mean, so much of the job is really about, I think, being able to adapt to different directors, honestly, because every director is different. It's amazing, because it's not like they all get together and like compare notes on how they all direct. It's like it's a very singular thing in that, directors develop their own style. I mean, there'll be some directors who you don't talk to at all until, way after filming. The first time you really start having serious creative discussions with them is way after filming is over, because they're just so busy with shooting and everything else, and it's just not part of their process
Mhm.
to be involved in that way. But Tim, on the other hand, like I explained, it's his process to be very, very involved every day, multiple times a day if possible. So everyone is different, and you really just have to, serve the director, serve the project, and do what works for them. What is the best way to help them in their process?
Now, every project has its unique challenges. What were some of the challenges on Beetlejuice Beetlejuice?
Just the prospect of following up just an iconic movie, I think, was just a pressure that got to everyone in one way or another, because the last thing you want is for people to say, oh, they should have left that alone. It was like it was better when it was just a single movie just on its own, or you ruined my childhood. This was like my favorite movie and now it's ruined. That's the last thing we want. You want it to be a
Mhm.
worthy follow-up, you want it to be fun and creative, and to really stake out its own identity and carve out its own purpose and reason for existing. So I think overall that was something that everyone really felt, whether they were new to the film or whether they had worked on the original film. Definitely everyone felt that. And but the positive side of that is it really pushed everyone to really be creative. I mean, people were really, really engaged on this project, across the board. And it makes everyone want to do their best because they know that the stakes are high and the original movie is important to a lot of people, and those are really the people that you're serving as the fans of who love it. So that was definitely a big challenge that pushed us creatively kind of every day on every level. But you see it like in all the footage and the scenes and the actors and the editing and the photography and the production design. I think on every level, props, costumes, like on every level you have people who are just kind of pushing to do their best. And that was the amazing thing about having worked on Wednesday, and that being so popular,
Mhm.
and Jenna becoming this household name overnight, and then
Yeah.
her being involved in the sequel, because I think that is an entry point for a lot of people. And just anecdotally, I've heard lots of stories of kids seeing the movie and just being kind of bowled over by it, by the creativity, by the fun. So it does seem to be something that people can relate to, even if they don't have that nostalgic relationship with the first one.
Now, I'm going to read this off of the screen because this is something you had said in a previous interview. Now, you explained that you dealt with switching styles and rhythms by thinking of Beetlejuice as a character who's kind of all over the place. Now, would you say your editing choices were more influenced by the character's personality, almost as if Beetlejuice himself had his way with the edit?
When you start a new project, you're looking for, well, what is the editing language of this film? You know, and that was definitely one thing that I just kind of instinctually, discovered. Um, Not for the real world stuff in the movie, but for definitely for the afterlife segments, definitely giving it the editing and the style and the vibe a Beetlejuice tone, like he's infused in the whole movie, even when he's not on screen or it's not a Beetlejuice. Is that I mean, and one way that I did that, which is just something that I don't know. I just started doing it and it seemed right. But just these kind of like really abrupt scene transitions, because Beetlejuice it does abrupt scene transitions just in his dialogue and he snaps his fingers and his clothes change or he's across the room. So that was something that I kind of discovered, is these kind of abrupt, just these kind of very shocking abrupt music changes, just like a piece of music just comes in really hard and unexpected, almost like a jump scare in a way. It's like, whoa, where'd that come from? And then the scene cuts to the next thing. And, so that was just one kind of thing in the editing language that was inspired by just the character and the world of Beetlejuice.
Excellent. Now, you had also mentioned that a lot of the structure of the film was developed in the editing process. Now, does that happen quite a lot when something worked on paper but doesn't really work in the edit?
Yeah, it's something you kind of discover because when they're shooting, you're kind of just editing all the individual scenes, and you have a sense of how it fits into the larger narrative, and you're kind of editing it with that in mind. But still
Mhm.
you don't really get a sense of the flow until later. At first you're just kind of doing individual scenes and making sure those work, and how you feel about the, or sometimes they don't work. It's you're figuring out as you're doing it, is this a good scene, is this scene working, is it not working, can it be improved? So that's one
Mhm.
thing, is you're just kind of trying to shape and improve and do the best with the scenes just individually. And then at the end of shooting, well, for me at least, that's usually when I start assembling, and that's a really important time for me, because it's really, I just need that time to kind of focus and just start to put the scenes in order for the first time, because that's when I start to see how the flow works, you know,
Okay.
and what you thought was a good scene, sometimes you put it in the flow of the movie and it's suddenly not a good scene anymore, for whatever reason. It's just, it doesn't work the way it did when you just watched as an individual scene. So, there's lots of things that you can discover when you start assembling the film in order and seeing. You know, sometimes you
Mhm.
work on a project and you just start assembling in order that way, and it's like magic. You know, it's like it just kind of flows and it's working, and there are connections among between the scenes that you didn't even see, that you didn't even realize were there before, and things kind of take on their own kind of flow. But I guess more often it's the case where you start assembling and you get halted at a certain point, and it's just not
Mm.
the scene, you know. And that was definitely the case with this movie, is that for me it had like a really good, you know, 15 minutes or so where it just felt, you know, like it was all flowing, and then it just, the scenes didn't connect to each other properly, you
Mm.
know. And it just, it all felt like non sequiturs. You'd go from this scene
Ah.
to that scene to that scene, all with different characters. I mean, this is a movie with tons of different characters, tons
Mhm.
of different locations. It all felt disconnected when you go from scene to scene. And it was also something that Tim had flagged on early on that he was concerned about, was just the flow of how these scenes would work together, because he just had kind of an instinctual feeling that there's a better structure in here somewhere than what was in the script. And yeah, I mean, and I definitely felt that when I started
Yeah.
assembling, because yeah. So I mean, part of that process is then restructuring, reordering, making, trying to find connections between each films, between each scene, so it's not just like a non sequitur. It's like, is there some way that this scene can connect to the next scene, you know? And sometimes they're almost like
Mhm.
stream of consciousness connections, like, oh, it's, this is connected to this because of you know, whatever, just kind of little detail. One just very small example was, you know, there's a scene where Rory is trying to get to his wedding, you know, towards the end of the film.
Mhm.
And so the priest drives him off to the wedding. And then the next scene in our restructure was Delia in the waiting room in the afterlife. Scenes that aren't really connected, you know?
Mhm.
So, but one thing that I did to just try to connect them was we just created an ADR line where Delia says, out of the way, you know, she's trying to get to the front of the line. And so we added her saying, out of the way, I'm late for a wedding. So at least there's some kind of connection, is that both Delia and Rory are trying to get to the wedding at the same time, you know? So it was things like that, is finding what does one scene have to do with the other. And if there isn't
Mhm.
a connection built in, then it's how do we fabricate it? Or how do we film something that can be a transition between these scenes to connect them? And that was something we did a lot too.
Are there any lessons that you believe writers can take away from, things that you have to quote unquote fix in the edit? Or is it just an inevitable process of everything?
That is a common problem, you know. I
Mhm.
mean, you know, the like the one I described where scenes just seem disconnected from each other, that is something that happens a lot.
Mhm.
um I think it's because in a writing environment, there's often this feeling of like, that's you know, often that's built into the structure, is that, you know, you have an A story and a B story and a C story, sometimes a D story and E story. And some writers kind of look at them as like checkerboarding those scenes.
Mhm.
You know, like we'll cut between them.
Right.
And you know, I mean, you know, sometimes that can work, you know, especially in a TV show, you know, that's something that can work
Mhm.
all the time. But a lot of the times it's, you find in editing that they don't go together, you know. I mean, well, they weren't designed to, you know, so of course they don't. But it kind of often happens at editing that that does become a negative, you know,
Mhm.
because you lose a sense of story momentum a lot of the time.
Ah,
So,
yeah.
and you kind of forget what happens, you know. I think when writers are writing that, they're often thinking about it like, well, the A story has a cliffhanger, and then you want to get back to it. And while you're on that cliffhanger, you go to the B story, and then when you come back to the A story, you resolve the cliffhanger, and that's kind of how you modulate audience interest. I think that's a concept, but a lot of the times it just doesn't feel that way, you know? And
Yeah.
it just feels like you're kind of being overloaded with story and disconnected things. And so by the time you get back to the A story to resume the cliffhanger, you've kind of forgotten as a viewer that you were following that story or you were waiting for that to resolve. So, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes me think of, like we mentioned earlier, something might work on paper where as when it comes to the actual edit and
Yeah.
the actual visualization of it, it just doesn't quite work out the same.
Ideally there is this additional thought process because obviously no one's going to have the pros when, you come to watch the movie. So, hopefully there is a kind of additional thought process in terms of actually how is this going to look,
Mhm.
and visually what are the cues that are going to orient the audience, because sometimes that gets missed
Mhm.
and from a filmmaking perspective it's not kind of built into the script how you're kind of reorienting the audience. That's something I've seen on several
Right.
different projects as well, is there isn't that kind of additional thought process of, well, how do we actually execute this, and when we execute it, how is it going to look.
Did the original Beetlejuice inform your edits in any way? Did you try and, I won't try and pay an homage and you're like, "Oh, they had this type of edit, I'm gonna do something similar." It's kind of in those terms.
I don't think in terms of like editing specifically.
Okay.
Tim, has said several times that, he didn't go back and watch the original movie before doing this one, because he wanted to kind of not be directly inspired by what he did in the first one. More so, he wanted to shoot the sequel with a kind of emotional memory of what that film was to him. And I knew that from the beginning of the process, from the beginning of filming, that that's how he felt about it. So I think I probably took my cues from him in that way. Like I didn't, go back and watch the film. I watched little bits and pieces, I think, for
Mhm.
various, you know, reasons. But no, I didn't watch the movie all the way through. But I mean, also I'd seen it so many times in my life. I pretty much do have a encyclopedic knowledge of the film. One thing that I did ask Tim about early on was there's almost a Looney Tunes kind of aspect to the Beetlejuice character,
Mhm.
which is obviously an editing thing, you know? So I did ask him, like, is that something you see as part of the Beetlejuice character? Because, also, I don't know. I mean, that could have been a something that was done without his input on the original. Like, I don't know. So, I did ask if that was something that he saw with just like wacky sound effects and that kind of thing. And he said like, yes, absolutely. Well, I think his reference is like Tex Avery. He's more
Oh.
from the Tex Avery world than Looney Tunes. Yes, he said absolutely. But it's also really important to him that Beetlejuice is not a cartoon character. Is that he isn't just this wacky, funny, silly guy. It's that he also is a demon, and he has at times real malevolence to him, and that was part of something we didn't want to lose as well. Is we
Mhm.
wanted to protect those moments where Michael really kind of delivered those malevolent kind of moments. So that was definitely something that was taken from the original film, just kind of pushing it more in that kind of Looney Tunes direction a little bit. But other than that, yeah, I mean, I think I just kind of took Tim's cues in terms of, just kind of working on this film based on our emotional memories of what that first film meant to us and how we imagine that world to be.
Yeah, I think that's why, when I first saw the original, it I loved the character of Beetlejuice so much. There was just so many layers to him. It's like, yeah, he was this zany, like off the wall
Yeah.
kind of character, but that there are these moments was like, oh, that was kind of scary.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
absolutely. I mean, that's part of, it's like it is, it's a comedy. It's primarily a comedy in my eyes,
Mhm,
but it is also supposed to be a horror, and it is, I
mhm.
mean, obviously for adults, it's not that scary, I'm sure. even though I think this film is more intense than the previous one was. But you know, that's part of it. Is it's supposed to be scary. It's supposed to, you know, deal with heavy subject matters like death in
Hmm.
a kind of a digestible way, you know, and that's something kids are thinking about, you know, you know,
Yeah.
struggling with death. What is it? What is it? You know, and for me as a kid watching it, you know, it starts to help you kind of process some of these feelings and thoughts that you're having around that subject. And I think the second film is the same way. It kind of answers questions in a way about, you know, what happens when you die.
Were there any other inspirations that you had that you kind of brought into the edit?
In many ways, the film has a lot of these musical segments. It's not like it's a musical,
Hmm.
but, you know, it does have a lot of segments where the song is really driving. You know, there's like the tragedy
Hmm.
Bee Gees section, there's a Soul Train section, there's a MacArthur Park section, you know, and, you know, that was something that Tim is like interested in exploring now, is like kind of less dialogue and just kind of letting things kind of flow with just music and imagery. We thought about those segments really as kind of musical moments, you know, as opposed to
Yeah.
just like songs in the background or whatever. I mean, we thought of them with the music big, strong, forward, you know, and just really driving the sequences. And, you know, so that's something that makes them really fun for me.
Now you mentioned there were two sides of Beetlejuice, scary and comedic. How do you approach, editing comedy moments versus the more scary moments? Do you have a specific kind of like editing style when it comes to those different kind of scenes?
Yeah, it's funny because it's like it seems like that's a kind of a theme that often runs through my career is that I work on so many projects that have this kind of mix of genres, and I'm very grateful for that because I personally love that. So, you know, I mean, I'm really you know, the Scream series is an example that mixes horror and comedy, and you know, a lot of other projects that I've done do that as well, mix different genres, and that is always just so much fun because to me it really lets you work the film in different modes. You know, you get to try out different
Mhm.
styles, you know, and definitely like Beetlejuice is a movie editorial wise, it has almost like different movements to it. You know, there's different sections that have different feelings to them. And you move into all these different styles, like whether it's the kind of old Mario Bava Italian film style or, you know, like the 70s disco style or you know just like the 90s movie montage or you know I mean you get to kind of explore all these different kind of tropes and to me switching genres switching tones that just makes a film come alive to an audience. You're not stuck in a single mode or a single way of telling a story. You switch, and I think that makes things more engaging for an audience because they
Mhm.
don't always know exactly what they're going to get. When something switches up, it's kind of more fun and engaging, and it kind of makes you sit forward and go, oh well, what's happening now? You know, with the mixing of horror and comedy, I think that's just, you know, it makes the funny funnier and it makes the scary scarier because you're not exactly sure if you're getting a comedy moment or a horror moment. And you could think it's going to be funny, and then it's just this horrifying thing, you know, or the opposite. I think just the kind of the bait and switch of that, you know, and
Mhm.
just kind of playing that game with the audience of what they're going to get is kind of just what makes that just so fun to do editorially because you can kind of lead them in one direction and then surprise them, you know. But I mean, that was definitely something that I discovered in Scream when I was editing Scream 6 because it's like, you know, you just lull the audience into a certain type of scene and then you just do a
Mhm.
hairpin turn and, you know, it makes it scarier a lot of the time. Cuz often horror in our lives intrudes in our lives in other moments. You know, it's
Mhm.
like you could be having a happy moment in your life and then something horrible happens. It's like it's something that crashes in on your life in an unexpected way. That's what makes it so horrifying, you know? So
Definitely.
it's like, a lot of horror movies are in a single tone. It's all in kind of
Mhm.
this scary, creepy kind of tone all the way through. But, you know, that's not how life is. That's not, people don't live in a horror environment. It's something that intrudes forcefully and abruptly.
If you could go back to the beginning and talk to yourself when you were just starting out, what advice would you give yourself?
Definitely the toughest time was right when I got out of university. And I knew I wanted to edit, but I didn't have any idea of like where to go or what to do. It just felt impossible. The advice that I would have wanted to get at that time was like meet people, and I think it's easier probably nowadays, is because it's so much easier to get in touch with
Mhm.
people with social media and all these different means. You are able to look people up and talk to them and get advice. And a lot of the times people will be willing to do that.
Mhm.
And I think like the best way to go about that is to really look up people who, I guess, maybe live near you is one thing, because they can kind of give you advice on just what the industry is like in that area. They could perhaps give you specific advice for your particular where you live. But looking up people who you are interested in talking to, like legitimately, either people
Mhm.
who have worked on a movie that you loved or are working on the kinds of or whatever, like whatever the connection is, not just kind of
Right.
like casting the net super wide. Like I'll talk to anybody and anybody, everybody and anybody. It's like, really figuring out who are the people who inspire me, who are doing the kinds of things I want to do, and reaching out with a kind of personal story about who you are, what you're trying to achieve, and why you think they might be able to help you.
Mhm.
And that's advice that I'd give, I guess, is because it took me a long time. It was really hard to even meet anyone who was working in the
Mhm.
industry. I didn't even know how to do that. And I think nowadays that's way easier. So it was like just such a slow process of just even making any kind of connections with people at all. And just the way this industry is, it's so much about networking and connections. It's really a
Mhm.
kind of personal industry in that way. And just the more people the better it is. So, yeah.
Now you touched on this a little bit that the industry has changed since from when you started to now. What advice, tips, or tricks would you give an upcoming editor in breaking into the industry, making contacts, and along those lines?
The way I did it was, I just started editing.
Mhm.
Um, and that's something I mean, it was my path and it worked for me. So, of course, I recommend that. um, but I also had the luxury of living at home for a couple years. I didn't have to make a lot of money. So, I mean, that's the kind of downside of that path. Oftentimes, people need to earn money. And when you're just kind of trying to start out as an editor, you're not going to make a lot of money. But if you
Mhm.
can, I recommend that path, because it's great to be able, it's something that really helped me to be able to just plant my flag and say I'm an editor. I didn't have to work my way up, from the bottom of the career ladder. I just started as an
Mhm.
editor and worked my way up on quality of projects. So that was the ladder I climbed. So, if it's possible financially, I really think the best thing to do is to just edit, because even no matter how much you learn, whatever you do in school, whatever, it doesn't compare to just being able to do the job. And because you
Mhm.
learn so much, especially, I also had the benefit of working at a television network where the volume was so high. You had to edit, like a short documentary or two every day. You're
Wow.
just editing, edit, like, and that really hones your skills. That's the best way to learn, is to edit and edit a lot. So if it's possible financially for you to do that, I really think that's the best way to go. But of course, if you need to get a job that earns more money, you will, have to start kind of lower down on their career ladder and work your way up that way. Because, if you're just starting out as an inexperienced editor, people aren't going to pay you a lot of money to do it.
Excellent. Well, Jay, those are all the questions we have for you today.
Great.
Thank you so much for taking the time. We
Yeah,
really
thank
appreciate
you.
it. For more interviews or deep dives into the StudioBinder software, like and subscribe to be notified when new videos are added. I'm Brandon with StudioBinder Academy. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.